The town was the kind of place people often described as charming, though to her it felt more like a fishbowl. With its single main street, 2 diners, and a courthouse that doubled as a clock tower, everybody knew everybody, or at least thought they did. Gossip traveled faster than trains that thundered through once a day, and appearances mattered as much as church attendance on Sunday mornings. A polished lawn, a pressed shirt, a clean smile, these were badges of belonging. In her small corner of America. But she carried something different. On her left arm, woven into skin by ink and needle, stretched a tattoo bold, black lines shaped into a trident with numbers inscribed beneath. To strangers, it was just an emblem. To her, it was everything. It was the memory of her father, a Navy man who had gone to sea and never come back. It was the legacy of the man who had taught her to ride a bike, to bait a hook, and to never back down from what she believed in. It was her way of keeping him alive when the world insisted he was gone. Yet in the eyes of her neighbors, the tattoo wasn't sacred, it was scandal. She still remembered the first time she noticed the whispers. It was a humid summer afternoon, and she had walked into Mel's diner with her sleeves rolled up. The trident caught the light as she reached for a menu. From the corner booth, 2 older women paused their conversation, eyes narrowing. One leaned in, muttering something behind her hand. Both shook their heads with disapproval. She pretended not to see, but inside her chest, something twisted. That day was just the beginning. In a town like hers, image was currency. Tattoos were considered rebellion, markers of wildness, of lives lived on the edge rather than within polite society. When men bore them, they were excused as youthful mistakes. When women did, it was different. Trashy, they called it. Unladylike. As weeks passed, she realized her father's emblem made her into a story that circulated behind her back, a cautionary tale traded between neighbors. Such a shame, someone had whispered once at the grocery store. Pretty girl, ruined. By ink. She wanted to scream the truth, that the tattoo wasn't rebellion but reverence, not shame but love. But something in her stopped. Maybe it was the rawness of her grief, the vulnerability that cracked her voice when she spoke of her father. Maybe it was the certainty that they wouldn't understand anyway. So she stayed silent, carrying the story of the tattoo like a secret locked in her chest. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself the whispers didn't matter, that her father would be proud she carried his symbol. But day by day, the sting grew sharper. The mockery wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a glance held too long, a smirk, a raised eyebrow. Other times it was blatant. Once, while waiting in line at the pharmacy, a man behind her said to his friend, "Bet she regrets that thing already." The friend laughed. Her ears burned, but she kept her eyes forward. She clutched her prescription bag like a shield and walked out before tears could spill. What hurt most wasn't the ridicule itself, but the loneliness it carved. She felt like she was living 2 lives, one in which she was a dutiful daughter carrying her father's memory, and another in which she was branded as someone reckless, rebellious, and shameful. The dissonance weighed heavily. At night, staring at the tattoo. In the mirror, she whispered, "They don't know you, Dad. They don't know what this means." But even the comfort of those words sometimes felt thin. Her mother didn't help matters. A practical woman hardened by loss, she had raised her daughter with quiet strength after the funeral. But she never approved of the tattoo. "You didn't need to mark your body for him," she had said the day her daughter came home with the bandage still raw on her skin. "He's in your heart, not your arm." Though the words weren't cruel, they carried disappointment, and that disappointment left an ache that never fully healed. Her mother never mocked her the way the townsfolk did, but the silence in their house about the tattoo was almost worse. It was as though, even at home, The ink was something to hide, so she learned to cover up. Long sleeves in the summer, jackets in the fall, strategic bracelets when she couldn't hide it completely. It was exhausting, living in a kind of disguise, always thinking about fabric and angles, always shrinking from the possibility of exposure. But sometimes, when the sun was too hot, or when she was too tired to care, the tattoo slipped into the open. And when it did, so did the whispers, the chuckles, the shame. Her friends weren't much better. In high school, she had belonged to a small circle of girls who braided each other's hair, shared secrets, and planned futures. But as the tattoo became a permanent part of her, some of them pulled away. "You've changed," one of them said bluntly, though she hadn't. She was the same girl, just carrying her father in a new way. But in their eyes, the ink became her identity. Invitations slowed. Phone calls stopped. By the time she realized she was no longer part of the group, it was too late to repair what had slipped away. The cruelest moment came at a town festival. She had been standing near the stage, listening to the local band play, when a group of teenagers passed by. One boy pointed at her arm and laughed. "What did you do? Get drunk and think you're tough?" His friends erupted in laughter. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to cry. It wasn't toughness she was displaying, it was devotion. But the words echoed, and the laughter carried, as she felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Still she endured, because underneath the pain and the mockery, there was pride. The tattoo wasn't just a mark on her skin, it was a lifeline. It reminded her of nights when her father told stories about the sea, of mornings when he rose before dawn to run, of the way he saluted with crisp precision before leaving for deployment. Every time her eyes landed on the trident, she felt connected to him, as though the ink was a tether keeping him close. And that connection mattered more than whispers. It mattered more than shame. Yet, even with that pride, she longed for a day when anyone would see the tattoo for what it truly was. Not a mistake, not rebellion, not shame, but love. A symbol of sacrifice and memory. She didn't know when or how that moment would come. For now, she simply carried it alone, a quiet defiance in a town that judged her for what they couldn't understand. And so she walked through her small world, sleeved or unsleeved, loved by her father's memory and judged by her neighbors. Ignorance. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet imagine, was that beyond the whispers and ridicule, a moment was coming on that would silence every laugh, every smirk, every cruel word. A moment when her father's legacy would speak louder than gossip ever could. Her father had been larger than life in her childhood. To the neighbors, he was simply Commander Ross, a quiet Navy man who came home in uniform and drove an old pickup with discipline written in its dents. But to her, he was laughter on. The back porch, stories by the fire, and a steady presence that made the world feel unshakable. She remembered the way his boots thudded against the wooden steps after deployment, how he would sweep her up in his arms, spinning her until the world blurred. He smelled of salt and starch, of ocean winds carried across continents. He had been gone more often than he was home, but she never resented it. She knew, even as a little girl, that her father's work wasn't ordinary. He belonged to the Navy SEALs, a brotherhood bound by grit, sacrifice, and silence. She didn't understand the details. Missions were never spoken of, dangers never explained, but she knew the gravity of what he did. "Some jobs aren't about glory, kiddo," he once told her, ruffling her hair. "They're about making sure others get to sleep safely at night." Those words never left her. The night the officers came, her world collapsed. It was early evening when the doorbell rang. She was 17. Her mother opened the door, and two men in dress uniforms stood there, their faces carved with solemnity. She knew before they spoke. The words, killed in action, hung heavy in the air. Her mother crumpled. She stood frozen, her chest hollowing out. When they handed over the folded flag, she touched it with trembling fingers, as if fabric could replace flesh. The funeral blurred in her memory, flags at half-mast, bagpipes keening, rifles firing into the sky. What she remembered most was the silence afterward, the way the house felt cavernous without his voice. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of boots on the steps that would never come again. Grief was heavy, relentless, an anchor tied to her chest. Weeks later, she found herself in his study. His desk was neat, his books lined like soldiers. In the top drawer, she discovered a small wooden box. Inside lay his medals, his service patches, and a trident emblem, a gold insignia that represented the seals. She cradled it in her palm, tears streaming. The emblem wasn't just metal. It was his life distilled into a single shape, the anchor for Navy, the eagle for the nation, the pistol and trident for readiness and sea. It was his identity, his sacrifice, his story. It was then she decided to carry it with her. The tattoo was born of that moment. She had never considered ink before. She had been the kind of girl who drew flowers in notebooks, not on skin, but this was different. She wanted something permanent, something that couldn't be folded away in a box or tucked into a drawer. She sketched it first, her father's trident, with his service number etched beneath. When the tattoo needle first buzzed against her arm, she clenched her jaw, enduring the sting. Pain didn't matter. What mattered was permanence. Each line etched his memory into her flesh. When it was finished, she stared at it in the mirror. The black ink gleamed against her pale skin, bold and unashamed. For the first time since the funeral, she felt closer to him. She touched the lines gently, whispering, "I'll carry you." But carrying him came with weight. The townsfolk never asked about the tattoo's meaning. They never wondered why a quiet girl would suddenly choose something so bold. They assumed rebellion, assumed recklessness. They didn't see the nights she fell asleep, clutching the folded flag. They didn't know about the box of medals or the silence that echoed through her house. To them, the tattoo was decoration. To her, it was survival. Sometimes she wished she could explain. There were moments when the whispers cut too deep, when her chest ached with the urge to shout, "It's my father. He died for you too." But the words stayed locked inside. Explaining felt like opening a wound, and she wasn't sure she could endure their blank stares if they still didn't understand. So she bore it alone, clinging to her secret meaning while the world misjudged. Her mother rarely mentioned the tattoo, though she knew its story. The night she revealed it, her mother's eyes had glistened with unshed tears. "You didn't need to do this," she said softly. "He lives in you already." But the girl only shook her head. "I needed to see him," she whispered. Her mother pressed her lips together and nodded, though her silence afterward spoke volumes. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was resignation, perhaps, or quiet grief. For her, the tattoo became ritual. Each morning, as she brushed her hair in the mirror, her eyes would drift to the trident. She would touch it lightly, the way one might touch a photograph. On difficult days, birthdays, anniversaries, Veterans Day, she traced the lines with her fingertip, as though drawing strength from the ink itself. It reminded her she wasn't just a girl abandoned by tragedy. She was the daughter of a man who had chosen courage over comfort, duty over safety. Yet pride and pain were twins. The same tattoo that gave her strength also isolated her. At school, when classmates laughed, she would remind herself, "They don't know. They don't matter." But their words still sank deep. At work, when coworkers snickered, she repeated, "This isn't for them. It's for him." But the sting lingered long after. There was a duality she lived with daily: pride in her father's legacy, and shame imposed by those who didn't understand. Some days, the pride won. Other days, the shame was heavier. But always, beneath it all, was love. One evening, months after the funeral, she sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky blazed orange and red, and she imagined her father's voice beside her. "Some jobs aren't about glory, kiddo," he whispered in memory. She pressed her fingers to the tattoo. "I know, Dad," she murmured. "But this is mine. My job is to remember you." In the quiet glow of twilight, she realized the tattoo wasn't just about carrying him. It was about carrying herself, through grief, through judgment, through the loneliness of being misunderstood. It was a compass when she felt lost, a shield when the world mocked, a reminder that sacrifice was never in vain. And though she didn't know it yet, though she couldn't yet see the path ahead, there would come a day when the trident on her arm would no longer be a source of mockery. There would come a day when the world would finally see what she had always known, that it was not ink, but honor. By the time she reached college, the whispers had sharpened into words, and the smirks had become open laughter. High school had been cruel, but at least there the people knew her history. At least some of them remembered her father, remembered the funeral, remembered the way she clutched that folded flag with trembling hands. College was different. It was a new environment, full of strangers who saw only a young woman with ink on her arm. To them, she was nothing but an easy stereotype to mock. At first, she believed college would free her. It was bigger than her small town, with more diversity and less rigid expectations. She thought people might understand, or at least not care. But indifference wasn't what she found. Instead, she became a target for the same judgments, only louder. In dorm hallways, she overheard girls whisper, "Did you see her arm? Who? Does that at her age?" In class, she caught guys nudging each other, smirking as they mouthed words she didn't want to decipher. One afternoon in the cafeteria, a group of students sitting behind her burst into laughter. She had just set down her tray when one of them said loudly, "Bet she thinks she's tough." Ink like that usually means daddy issues. The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, echoing across the room. She froze. The words stabbed deeper than they knew, because her daddy issues weren't imagined. They were real. They were a folded flag, a funeral, an empty chair at the dinner table. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream the truth, but instead, she pushed her tray aside, appetite gone, and walked out without a word. The isolation grew heavier with every passing week. She had acquaintances, classmates, who exchanged polite greetings, but no real friends. She never dared tell anyone the story of the tattoo, because how could she? How could she open herself up like that, only to be dismissed? What if they didn't care? What if they laughed anyway? So she built walls. She kept her conversations short, her expressions guarded. The tattoo, once meant to tether her to her father, had become a barrier between her and the world. The cruelest moments came not from strangers, but from people she had hoped to trust. One evening, a group project in her communications class had turned into casual conversation. They were sitting around a library table when one of the girls, scanning her arm, tilted her head and said, "So, what's with the tattoo? Some ex-boyfriend's idea of forever?" The others chuckled. Heat flared in her chest. She wanted to tell them it wasn't about romance. It wasn't about rebellion. She wanted to tell them it was about sacrifice, about service, about her father who would never come home. But her voice stuck. She forced a laugh, shrugged, and changed the subject. Later, walking back to her dorm in the dark, she hated herself for the silence. Why couldn't she just tell them? Why couldn't she say, "It's my father's trident. He was a Navy SEAL. He died in action"? The words formed easily in her mind, but in real life, they felt impossible. Maybe because she feared the aftermath. What if they gave her pitying looks? What if they shrugged and went back to their conversations as though his life, his death, meant nothing? That would be worse than mockery. At least mockery acknowledged her. Indifference would erase him completely. And so she stayed quiet. But silence had its own cost. The more she hid her truth, the heavier the ridicule felt. The tattoo, visible no matter how many bracelets or sleeves she used, became a constant source of anxiety. Every glance felt like judgment. Every laugh felt like ridicule. She avoided pool parties, gym classes, anywhere she might have to bear her arm. She skipped summer picnics where short sleeves were the norm. She lived as though the tattoo was something shameful, even though she knew in her heart it was sacred. The breaking point came one crisp fall afternoon. She had taken a rare step toward normalcy, joining a group of classmates for a football game. She wore a sweater, but as the afternoon grew warm, she rolled up her sleeves without thinking. The sunlight caught her tattoo, and within minutes, the whispers began. A boy 2 rows back muttered something crude. A girl in front of her snapped a photo on her phone, not even bothering to hide it. Moments later, she heard the click of messages being exchanged, the muffled laughter. By halftime, she could feel eyes burning into her arm from all directions. She lasted until the third quarter before she fled. She ducked out of the stadium, her heart pounding, her cheeks burning. By the time she reached her dorm, her chest heaved with sobs. She locked the door, collapsed on her bed, and curled into herself. She hated them for mocking her. She hated herself for caring. She hated the tattoo for making her a target. But most of all, she hated the world for not understanding, for twisting something sacred into something shameful. That night, staring into the mirror, she traced the tattoo with shaking fingers. "Why can't they see you?" she whispered. To the reflection, the trident stared back at her, unwavering, permanent. Her father's emblem was still there, still hers, still a connection no one could strip away. But for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake, not in honoring him, but in exposing herself to the cruelty of a world that would never understand. Her grief mixed with rage, a volatile storm inside her. She wanted to stand in front of them all and shout her truth, but the courage wouldn't come. Instead, she pulled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo once more. It felt like betrayal of her father, of herself, but it also felt like survival. Yet deep inside, something began to shift. The more the world mocked, the more fiercely. She clung to the memory behind the ink. Their ignorance only proved how little they knew of sacrifice, of love, of honor. She realized that even if she never told them, even if they never understood, the tattoo wasn't for them. It never had been. It was for her. It was for him. And no amount of ridicule could take that away. Still, the scars of mockery lingered. The laughter echoed in her ears long after the moments passed. The whispers haunted her steps in hallways, in classrooms, in crowded cafeterias. It felt as though her life had narrowed to 2 truths. She was her father's daughter, and she was their target. And though she didn't know it yet, though the pain felt endless, a day was coming when the very thing they mocked would silence them all. A day when the tattoo would no longer be a burden, but a badge recognized for what it truly was. The letter arrived on a quiet October morning, tucked between a stack of bills and a catalog that promised sales she could never afford. At first, she thought little of it, just another envelope with an official seal, another reminder that the world still spun forward without her father in it. She carried the mail inside, dropped it on the kitchen table, and set about making coffee. But the envelope lingered in her periphery, demanding attention. Its crisp weight, its neat typeface, it was different. When she finally tore it open, the words made her breath catch. You are cordially invited to attend the annual Veterans Day ceremony at Naval Station Merritt. This year's ceremony will honor the memory of those who gave their lives in service, including Commander Daniel Ross. Her father's name stared back at her, stark and unyielding. She read it once, twice, a third time, as if repetition could soften the blow. He had been gone for years, and yet seeing his name printed in black ink revived every ache. The folded flag flashed in her memory, the salute of the honor guard, the empty chair at the dinner table. She set the letter down and pressed her palms against her eyes. For years she had avoided these ceremonies. Her mother went occasionally, but she had always found excuses, assignments, jobs, fatigue. The truth was simpler. She couldn't face the sea of uniforms, the stiff salutes, the speeches that spoke of sacrifice in polished phrases, while glossing over the gaping wounds left behind. She couldn't stand the pitying glances, the murmured condolences. Every Veterans Day felt less like honor and more like reopening a scar. And yet this invitation was different. It carried the weight of official remembrance. Her father's name would be spoken aloud in a gathering of sailors, Marines, families, and commanders. His legacy wouldn't be tucked into a drawer or confined to her tattoo. It would live in the air, acknowledged, respected. Could she really stay away? The question haunted her all day. She carried the letter in her pocket, fingering its edges while she folded laundry, cooked dinner, washed dishes. That night, she placed it on her knitstand. In the dark, the words seemed to glow, whispering her father's name into her dreams. By morning, she knew she had to go. But knowing didn't mean wanting. The thought of standing in that crowd twisted her stomach. She could already hear the whispers. She imagined mothers clutching their children tighter, eyes flicking to the ink on her arm. She pictured veterans shaking their heads, thinking her father's daughter had strayed from dignity into defiance. The idea of exposing her tattoo in a place where his brothers in arms stood felt almost sacrilegious. Would they think she dishonored him by etching his trident into her skin? For days, she wavered. 1 hour she told herself she'd attend. The next she swore she wouldn't. Her mother said little when she mentioned it, only nodding once and murmuring, "It's your choice." That made it harder. Her mother had always been a master of silence, never pushing, never pulling, simply leaving her to wrestle with her own conscience. On the third night, she sat in her father's study. The room had remained nearly untouched since his passing. The bookshelf lined with military history, the desk stacked with journals, the old globe in the corner that he used to spin when telling her stories of places he'd seen. She opened the drawer again, lifting out the wooden box that had once revealed the trident emblem. The metals gleamed in the lamplight, cold and proud. She traced her finger over the gold of the trident, remembering the day she'd first held it, the decision that had led to the tattoo. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling, "would you want me there?" Silence answered, but it wasn't empty. She felt it, the weight of his presence, the echo of his lessons. He had always believed in facing things head-on. He had always told her courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it. If he could walk into combat zones, if he could shoulder the dangers of duty, surely she could stand in a crowd for one day. The next morning, she circled the date on her calendar. She would go. The question then became what to wear. It seemed trivial, even shallow, yet clothing mattered. It was armor in its own way. She wanted to honor the occasion with something respectful, something that wouldn't draw attention away from the meaning of the ceremony. She rifled through her closet, pulling out dresses and blouses, holding them against herself in the mirror. Most had sleeves that could cover her tattoo. But the thought of hiding it again gnawed at her. If the trident wasn't visible on that day, his day, what was the point? Finally, she chose a modest navy blue dress with short sleeves. Simple, clean, unadorned. It revealed the tattoo without flaunting it. As she stood in the mirror, tracing the ink with her finger, her reflection stared back with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't look like the girl who had once cowered at laughter in a cafeteria. She looked like someone standing on the edge of change. The days leading up to the ceremony were restless. She dreamt often of her father, sometimes vividly, as though he stood in the kitchen again, pouring coffee, whistling off-key. Other times the dreams were fragmented, boots disappearing into shadows, waves crashing against a ship's hull, the crack of rifles firing in a salute. She woke each morning with her heart heavy, but her resolve steadying. When the morning of the ceremony finally came, she rose before dawn. She stood at the bathroom sink, staring at her reflection as she brushed her hair, applied a touch of makeup, and slipped into the navy dress. Her hands trembled as she pinned on her father's medal, fastening it over her heart. The trident on her arm and the medal on her chest created a strange symmetry. Two pieces of him, one etched in her skin, the other forged in bronze. As she stepped outside, the air was sharp with autumn. Flags along Main Street fluttered, lining the way as if the whole town were preparing for remembrance. She gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove, her pulse thrumming with each mile closer to the naval base. At the entrance, guards checked IDs and waved cars through. She parked and joined the stream of families walking toward the gathering area. Children skipped beside parents in uniforms. Widows walked slowly, clutching photographs. Veterans moved with deliberate steps, their medals clinking faintly in the morning breeze. She felt out of place, caught between generations of service and sacrifice, a civilian with a story carved into her arm. As she approached the crowd, the first whispers began. A pair of women in neat dresses glanced at her tattoo, eyes flicking back and forth with quiet judgment. A man in a polo muttered something to his wife, lips curling faintly. The old familiar burn crept up her cheeks. For a moment, doubt screamed at her to turn around, to retreat to her car and drive home before the ceremony began. But then she remembered the box of medals, the folded flag, the sound of her father's voice, calling her kiddo. She remembered why she came. Lifting her chin, she stepped into the gathering. The whispers trailed after her like shadows, but she walked forward anyway. The tattoo was visible, bold against her skin, and though fear coiled in her stomach, pride surged quietly beneath it. For once, she wasn't hiding. For once, she would carry him openly. What she didn't know was that her decision to wear that dress, to show that tattoo, would lead to a moment no one in that crowd would ever forget. The ceremony hadn't even begun, yet the air already crackled with unspoken words. As she walked deeper into the gathering area, the sound of flags snapping in the cold November breeze mixed with murmured conversations. Families clustered together on rows of folding chairs. Children squirmed on laps, their parents smoothing down collars and whispering reminders to stay still. Veterans stood in small groups, uniforms pressed and adorned with ribbons that glinted beneath the pale morning sun. And then there was her moving alone, each step echoing with the weight of choice. The first glance came from a woman adjusting her husband's tie. Her eyes darted to the tattoo, widened, then softened into something that wasn't quite kind. She leaned closer to whisper into her husband's ear, and though the words were lost in the wind, the tone was unmistakable. He gave the faintest nod without looking up. She lowered herself into an empty chair near the middle rows. The fabric of her dress tugged slightly at her knees as she sat, and she smoothed it down, forcing her hands to stay still when all she Wanted was to cross her arms and shield the ink from view. More eyes followed. 2 teenage boys, fidgeting on the edge of the row ahead, elbowed each other. One nodded toward her arm and stifled a laugh. Their mother caught them, shushing them. Sharply, but not before casting a quick, disapproving glance of her own. Every whisper felt like a pinprick against her skin. She stared straight ahead, fixing her gaze on the stage where a podium stood draped in navy blue cloth. The seal of the United States Navy gleamed proudly at its center. Chairs for dignitaries. And officers lined the platform, still empty, waiting for their occupants. She focused on the insignia, tracing its shape with her eyes, pretending the murmurs behind her didn't exist. But they did. Such a shame, someone murmured 2 rows back. Pretty girl. But the words faded, clipped short, but the implication was clear. She's showing that off here? At this ceremony? Another voice whispered, hushed but sharp. Her shoulders stiffened. She gripped the metal pin to her chest, pressing it against her heartbeat. For a moment, she wanted to rise, to leave the whispers and the heat of judgment behind. But she stayed rooted, forcing herself to remember why she came. This wasn't about them. It was about him. She could almost hear her father's voice, steady and warm. When you walk into a room, kiddo, walk like you belong there. Even if no one else thinks you do. So she straightened her back, lifted her chin, kept her hands resting calmly on her lap, though her pulse thudded against her ribs like a drum. The crowd thickened as the minutes passed. More families arrived, more uniforms, more eyes. She tried to steady her breath, but every inhale carried fragments of conversations she wasn't meant to hear. Disrespectful. Looks like rebellion, not remembrance. Her father's name is on the program, you know. Really? That's his daughter? Each fragment was a pebble in her chest, weighing heavier and heavier. She closed her eyes briefly, summoning the memory of the study, the medals in their wooden box, the trident emblem catching the light. That tattoo wasn't rebellion. It wasn't vanity. It was her anchor. Yet how could she explain that to people who only saw ink instead of meaning? A hush fell suddenly across the crowd, rippling from the stage outward. She opened her eyes to see the dignitaries arriving, officers in full-dress uniforms, their shoulders squared, their rows of ribbons gleaming in the morning sun. The audience rose respectfully as they ascended the platform, each movement synchronized, disciplined. She stood too, though her knees wobbled. Around her, families placed hands over hearts. Veterans raised salutes. She mimicked them, though she felt like a trespasser in their ritual. Her arm trembled slightly as she lowered it again. And then, when the crowd settled back into their seats, the whispers resumed. A woman behind her leaned toward a friend. I can't believe she wore that dress. Bold, I'll give her that. The friend's reply carried a laugh. Bold or foolish? The heat in her face spread to her ears. She clenched her hands together until her knuckles whitened. Her breath came faster, sharper. She imagined standing up, turning around, and shouting at them all, "This is my father's trident. He bled for this country. He never came home. And this ink is how I carry him with me every single day." But she said nothing. Her throat closed around the words, locking them inside. Instead, she stared once more at the podium, willing herself to endure. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone. His voice rang out, crisp and authoritative, welcoming families, honoring guests, and thanking veterans for their service. Applause rippled through the crowd, polite and reverent. She clapped too, though her hands shook. The speeches began, one officer speaking of sacrifice, another of unity, another of courage. She heard the words, but struggled to feel them. They floated above her like banners, noble and unreachable, while the whispers continued to coil through. The rose. A child pointed at her tattoo, tugging at his father's sleeve. The father shook his head quickly, murmuring something that made the boy's eyes widen before turning away. Her chest tightened. The shame she had fought so hard to bury clawed its way back to the surface. She had thought she was ready. She had thought she could face it. But sitting there, surrounded by sideways glances and half-hidden smirks, she felt like the girl in the cafeteria again, small and ridiculed. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The metal on her chest pressed against her with quiet weight, reminding her of the choice she had made. But the crowd's judgment felt louder than her father's voice, stronger than her own resolve. And then, just as her resolve began to crack, the ceremony shifted. The announcer's voice boomed with a new name. We now welcome Commander James Holloway, decorated Navy SEAL, to deliver today's keynote address. A ripple of respect passed through the audience. People straightened, applauded, leaned forward with anticipation. She looked up as the man strode onto the stage. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, he carried himself with the unshakable presence of someone who had seen war and returned stronger. His eyes scanned the crowd, steady and searching. And then impossibly those eyes found hers. Her breath caught. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, a nervous undercurrent against the commander's imposing silence. But something in the way he looked at her direct, unflinching, made her heartbeat slow. It was as if he recognized something the others had missed. The applause for the keynote speaker echoed across the open-air courtyard, blending with the rustle of flags overhead. Commander James Holloway walked with measured steps toward the podium, his polished shoes striking the wooden platform with deliberate weight. Every detail about him commanded attention. His dress whites gleamed immaculate against the November sky. Medals lined his chest in perfect symmetry, and his posture radiated the unshakable authority of someone who had lived through fire and returned to tell the tale. He was the kind of man whose presence alone silenced chatter. And yet this morning the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they thickened. As he crossed the stage, the murmurs in the crowd coiled tighter, the same ones that had tormented her since she'd arrived. People's eyes darted from the podium to her arm, then back again, the tattoo continuing to stir unease. She kept her gaze low at first, unwilling to draw more attention. Her fingers toyed nervously with the edge of her medal, tracing the grooves she knew by heart. But then, almost against her will, she lifted her eyes and found his. The commander's stride faltered, almost imperceptibly, as if he had been caught off guard. His gaze locked onto her arm, to the ink boldly revealed against her skin. He didn't sneer. He didn't smirk. He simply stared, and in that stare was something neither judgmental nor mocking, but deeply knowing. She froze under the weight of it. Her breath hitched. For a brief, unexplainable moment, it felt as though the crowd had disappeared, leaving only the two of them suspended in recognition. He reached the podium, but before addressing the microphone, his eyes flicked back toward her once more. A small shift barely there, but she noticed, and so did others. Whispers spiked instantly. Did you see that? He looked at her. Why is he staring at the girl with the tattoo? What does that mean? Heat surged in her chest. She didn't know whether to shrink back or sit taller. But the commander gave her no more than those two glances before, turning toward the crowd, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice low yet thunderous, trained to carry across storms and gunfire. We gather today not only to honor those who served, but to remember those who gave everything in that service. The audience hushed, instantly drawn into his cadence. His words were steady, not rehearsed but lived, carrying the kind of weight only experience could give. He spoke of sacrifice, not as an abstract concept, but as something he had seen firsthand: men carrying each other through firefights, women standing watch through endless nights, families left behind carrying burdens that never lightened. His tone wasn't polished like the other officers' speeches. It was rawer, grittier, grounded in memory. And still, in the middle of it all, her mind replayed that look. He recognized it. She was sure of it. The trident on her arm, the same emblem her father had carried, meant something to him. The way his eyes had softened, just for a heartbeat, had been unlike the judgment she'd endured for everyone else. She sat straighter, her pulse steadying for the first time since she'd arrived. As the commander's speech deepened, he paused, his gaze sweeping once more across the crowd. When his eyes found hers again, she nearly gasped. There was no mistake this time. He wasn't just scanning the audience. He was searching. And when he found her, his expression shifted again, something like acknowledgement, maybe even respect. Others noticed. She could feel the stir ripple outward. A woman leaned forward 2 rows ahead, trying to follow the line of his gaze. A man tilted his head, murmuring to his neighbor. The whispers began again, but they were different this time, curious rather than cruel. She held her ground. The commander continued, but the words began to feel less like a speech and more like a conversation directed squarely at her. "We speak of courage," he said, voice resonant, as if it belongs only to those in uniform. But courage is broader. It is carried by the families who endure the silence when their loved ones are gone, by the children who live with sacrifice written into their daily lives, by those who choose to carry forward memory in ways the world may not always understand. Her throat tightened. Was he speaking about her? No, it couldn't be. And yet her father's trident seemed to burn on her skin, as if answering his words. Applause broke out at intervals, but she hardly heard it. She was wrapped in the strange gravity between herself and the commander, the sense that he knew something the rest of the crowd didn't. Finally, as he concluded his speech, his voice dropped to a softer register. Sacrifice leaves marks. On our country, on our families, on our hearts. We honor not only those who served, but those who carry their memory. Every mark of remembrance is sacred. Her breath caught again. Every mark. The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. She clapped too, though her hands shook violently. The commander stepped back from the podium. Protocol dictated he remain seated with the other dignitaries. Instead, he paused. His gaze swept across the rows once more and landed directly on her. Then, to the astonishment of everyone gathered, he descended the stage. Gasps rippled through the audience. Murmurs erupted, confused, intrigued. No one expected a man of his stature to break from formality during a ceremony so tightly choreographed. But his steps were deliberate, purposeful. He moved through the aisle, past rows of startled families, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on her. She felt the world tilt. Her chest tightened so fiercely she thought she might faint. All around, heads turned, whispers sharpened into disbelief. What's happening? Why is he walking toward her? Is this part of the ceremony? She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The commander reached her row and stopped directly before her. For a long, breathless moment, he said nothing. His eyes dropped once more to her tattoo, then rose to meet her gaze. And then, before she could comprehend it, he lifted his hand. The salute was sharp, precise, unmistakable. Gasps broke across the courtyard. The whispers stopped altogether. Every sound, the flags, the shuffling chairs, the coughs and murmurs, fell into stunned silence. The commander, the decorated seal, was saluting her, not the officers on stage, not the dignitaries, Not the veterans lined in the front row. Her. And in that moment, the girl who had been mocked, shamed, and whispered about became the center of reverence. The salute hung in the air like a lightning strike, sudden, brilliant, impossible to ignore. The commander's arm was steady, his posture sharp with military precision. His expression carried none of the stiffness of formality, only solemn. Respect. For a moment, time fractured. The fluttering of flags slowed, the rustle of clothes hushed, even the whispers that had plagued her since she entered dissolved into nothingness. The entire courtyard froze. She stared at him, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. The ink on her arm seemed to throb with heat, as though her father's trident had been awakened by this single gesture. Her breath hitched, caught between disbelief and awe. She wanted to look away, to hide, to fold into herself, but she couldn't. His gaze anchored her, holding her upright when her knees threatened to buckle. No one had ever saluted her before. Not like this. Not in public. Not in front of an audience waiting to judge. The commander held the salute longer than custom dictated. He wasn't saluting out of habit. He was making a statement. Each second that passed tightened the silence around them until it became suffocating in its intensity. Finally, he lowered his arm, slowly, deliberately. And then he spoke. "This," he said, his voice low but carrying across the hushed courtyard, "is not a mark of rebellion. This is a mark of remembrance." The words cut through the silence like a blade. He gestured subtly toward her arm. "This trident belongs to those who served. I recognize it, and I recognize who she carries with her." His gaze swept the crowd briefly before returning to her. Her father was Commander Daniel Ross. He was one of us, and he was my friend. The ground beneath her seemed to vanish. Gasps rippled through the audience, sharper than any whisper had been. Her father's name, spoken aloud in the commander's steady baritone, landed like a thunderclap. The people who had mocked, judged, and sneered now sat frozen, caught in a web of shame and awe. The commander's eyes softened, though his tone remained resolute. He gave his life in service, and his daughter chose to honor him in the most permanent way she knew. That mark is not disgrace, it is devotion. Her throat closed. Tears blurred her vision, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had carried the tattoo in silence for years, endured mockery, hid her pain. Now, for the first time, someone spoke the truth she had never been able to say. Applause did not come immediately. No one dared move. The weight of the commander's words hung too heavy. Families glanced at one another, expressions shifting from disdain to realization, from judgment to shame. Mothers who had whispered turned pale. Fathers who had scoffed looked down at their hands. Even the teenagers who had laughed earlier now sat stiff and silent, their eyes wide with something like regret. The commander continued, his voice unwavering. "I knew her father. He carried himself with honor, courage, and loyalty to his team. He once told me his greatest pride was not his medals, not his rank, but his daughter." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today I see why." Her sob broke free, audible in the stillness. She pressed her trembling hand over her mouth, trying to contain it, but the sound only deepened the emotion in the air. The commander reached out, not touching her, but offering presence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "your father would be proud." That was the breaking point. Applause erupted, not polite, not perfunctory, but raw and thunderous. The audience rose to its feet, clapping with a force that echoed off the walls of the courtyard. Veterans saluted. Children clapped wildly. Mothers wept into handkerchiefs. The ripple of respect spread like wildfire, until everyone, every last person who had whispered, was on their feet, honoring her. She could hardly breathe. The roar of applause surrounded her, lifting her from years of shame into something she had never known before: recognition. For once, she was not the girl with that tattoo. She was the daughter of a man who had served, carrying his memory boldly, unapologetically. Her hands trembled as she rose to her feet, still overwhelmed. The commander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her standing as if she had just joined a formation. The applause surged louder. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel alone. The ceremony resumed, though everything after that moment felt like an echo. She barely heard the rest of the speeches. She barely noticed the order of the program. What lingered was the shift. The crowd transformed, their eyes no longer mocking, but respectful, reverent even. People glanced at her differently now, with softened faces, some even with tears. As the final rifle salute cracked through the air and taps played, she clutched the medal on her chest, her tears falling freely. The sound no longer broke her. It healed. For now, she understood that her father's legacy lived not only in folded flags and polished medals, but in the ink on her arm and the recognition it now carried. When the ceremony ended, people approached her. Strangers introduced themselves, some with apologies, others with words of gratitude. "Your father was a hero. I didn't know. I judged too quickly. I'm sorry." She nodded, overwhelmed, her voice too fragile to answer. And then, just before leaving, the commander returned. He stood before her no longer, the untouchable figure at the podium, but a man who had once stood beside her father. "Your father saved my life," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "On a mission overseas, I owe him everything. When I saw your tattoo, I knew immediately whose daughter you were. That's why I saluted. Not to you alone, but to him, through you." Her breath caught again, but this time with something brighter than grief: gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. The commander nodded once. "No, thank him. And thank you for carrying him with you. Never hide it again." With that, he offered one last salute, smaller, private, before turning away. She stood rooted in place, the noise of the dispersing crowd swirling around her. For years, she had been mocked, shamed, misunderstood. But in one moment, one salute, everything changed. The tattoo was no longer her burden. It was her father's honor. And now everyone knew it. The courtyard was nearly empty by the time she found the courage to move again. The folding chairs sat half-stacked, the stage dismantled by sailors in crisp uniforms, and the once bustling crowd had thinned to stragglers lingering in soft conversations. She still stood rooted near her row, clutching the medal at her chest. Her eyes were swollen, her cheeks damp, but her body thrummed with a strange, buoyant energy. For years, she had carried the weight of silence, and then, in a span of minutes, the weight had lifted. She turned her arm slowly, looking at the tattoo as though seeing it for the first time. The trident was unchanged, the same sharp lines inked into her skin, but the way she felt had shifted entirely. Where before it had been a shield against mockery, now it was a beacon. It no longer whispered shame, it thundered honor. A woman approached cautiously, wringing her hands together. It was one of the mothers she had overheard whispering earlier. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, eyes dropping. I owe you an apology. I judged what I didn't understand. That was wrong of me." For a heartbeat, the old instinct rose in her chest, to wave it off, to retreat, to hide. But instead, she straightened, just as her father would have. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady though quiet. It wasn't just ink. It was him. The woman's eyes shimmered. "I see that now." She reached out as if to touch her arm, but stopped short, respecting the boundary. Then she stepped back, her expression carrying not pity, but admiration. Others came too. A man in a veteran's cap clasped her hand with both of his, squeezing firmly. "I served with your father once, briefly," he said. "He was the kind of man who made the impossible seem routine. I should have recognized the trident sooner. Forgive me for not." Her throat tightened, but she managed a small smile. "You knew him, really?" "Only on a few operations." "But yes, the man." Sighed, nodding. "He was respected. Still is." He tipped his cap to her before stepping away. Each person who approached carried their own words, some apologies, some stories, some simple acknowledgments. Every one of them chipped away at the years of ridicule she had endured. Every one of them rebuilt something inside her that mockery had once shattered. At last, the crowd dispersed completely. The flags flapped in the growing wind, the sailors finished their cleanup, and the courtyard returned to stillness. She lingered, not quite ready to leave. Her fingers trailed along the empty chairs as she walked slowly toward the stage. When she reached the spot where the commander had stood, she paused. The wood still bore the faint scuff of his polished shoes. She closed her eyes and imagined her father standing there instead, tall, strong, grinning that crooked grin he always wore when he teased her. For the first time, the memory didn't slice her open. It filled her, warm and full. "You'd laugh at me for crying," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. "But today, I think you'd be proud." She descended the steps slowly, each one lighter than the last. On her way back to the parking lot, she passed groups of families who nodded respectfully. No one whispered now. No one smirked. Instead, they parted slightly as she walked, as though she carried an invisible honor guard. At her car, she paused again, resting her hand on the roof. Her reflection in the window startled her. She looked different. Not because of the tears or the navy blue dress, but because of the way she held herself. Taller, straighter, whole. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove out of the base with the letter still tucked into her purse. But this time, she wasn't running from the memory of her father. She was carrying it forward. The days that followed felt surreal. Word of the salute spread quickly through town. Some had filmed the moment on their phones, and though she hated the idea of her pain being captured, the footage became something else entirely, a testament. The clip circulated online, and comments poured in from strangers across the country. Respect, powerful. That commander spoke for all of us. Where once whispers had mocked her, voices now lifted her. Her tattoo, once scorned, was praised as a symbol of devotion. She read every comment with tears, realizing that her father's memory had leapt from her arm into the hearts of thousands. But the truest change was in her own town. People who had once dismissed her now greeted her warmly. At the grocery store, a cashier who had once smirked at her tattoo now said, "Your father must have been incredible." At the diner, a waitress who had once rolled her eyes at her ink now placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for carrying him with you." The shift was almost overwhelming. She had long believed her father's memory lived, only in her silence. Now she saw it lived everywhere, in the respect of strangers, in the changed hearts of neighbors, in the salute of a commander who refused to let her be shamed. One evening, she returned to her father's study. The wooden box still sat on the desk, its medals neatly arranged. She opened it again, this time not to weep, but to honor. She ran her fingers over the trident, then over the other decorations, each one representing a story she might never fully know. "People finally see you," she whispered into the stillness. "And they finally see me too." She set the box back gently, then glanced at her tattoo once more. She no longer felt the urge to cover it, even in public. The commander's words echoed, "Never hide it again." And she wouldn't. Months later, she stood once more in a crowd, this time at a local school assembly for Veterans Day. She had been invited to speak, not because she was a veteran, but because she was the daughter of one. She stood on stage, palms sweating, heart racing. But when she rolled up her sleeve and revealed the trident, the room fell silent in reverence, not mockery. "This tattoo isn't rebellion," she told the students, her voice clear. "It's remembrance. My father gave his life serving this country, and I chose to carry him with me, not in silence, but in ink, so the world would never forget him." The applause that followed wasn't as thunderous as the commander's salute, but it carried the same truth. She was no longer mocked. She was honored. That night, she dreamed of her father again. He wasn't in uniform this time. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, grilling in the backyard, laughing as smoke curled upward. He turned toward her, eyes twinkling, and gave her a single nod, small, quiet, but filled with pride. When she woke, she touched her tattoo and smiled through the tears. The whispers were gone. The honor remained.